Thank you everyone for joining us today. And my name is Anas. I'm Danish-Palestinian. And I'll be talking to Ariel today. First, before we begin, I just want to present the organizers, NASIM and the Turban Times. NASIM is a student-driven organization, NGO, and Turban Times is a media, and they're both working on addressing or highlighting issues from the MENA region in different ways. Also, thank you to the sponsors of this event. First of all, onlinekiosken.dk, who's very generously sponsored us today. And if you feel like having a snack or smoking some shisha, that's the place to go, I've been told. And also thank you to Græsbodsfonden for also sponsoring this event. And last but not least, thanks to Ariel for joining us. And we're glad that they let you into the country. It's very nice that you at least still allowed it to get into Denmark. And we'll get back to the joke afterwards. If you don't know what it's about, you'll understand later. The event for today is set to last until 8:30. About 8:30, we'll have a Q&A later. First of all, we're going to do a small talk between us. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please note them or just keep them in mind, and we'll have a Q&A maybe after the break. But even if we have it before the break, just let us know if you don't wish to be filmed. We have a cameraman working his ass off to make sure that we record everything. And if you don't want to be recorded, just let Messi know. Where is he?
Here.
Oh, he's down here. Yeah. So, let's begin. Ariel, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. So, my name is Ariel Gold, and I am a Jewish American activist. I am the national co-director for an organization based in the US called CODEPINK. I am the mother of 2 teenagers who are part of the Jewish American community, and what that means for us in the US is that we belong to a synagogue. My children attend Jewish summer camp. It's a heavily Zionist culture and society, to Jewish American culture and society in the US. And quite a contrast to my work and my family's values, which are freedom and equality for all people, and that we as a Jewish family have a responsibility to work for the liberation of Palestine and the Palestinian people, and to devote our lives to that.
Okay, so let's maybe delve into that a little bit. So, what's your position in terms of being a Jew in the U.S. and also being somewhat pro-Palestinian? How does that affect your daily life in the U.S.?
Sure. Well, I guess I could begin a little bit with how this came to be a part of my life. So, growing up, my family growing up was actually quite secular. We weren't as much a part of the Jewish community, but my grandparents were heavily Zionist, in fact, involved in the founding of the State of Israel before it was popular in the US. In the early 1900s, my family raised a lot of money in the US to send over to the Zionist operation in Palestine to establish the Jewish state. So I grew up with this, real pride in that, that this was supposed to be a great thing, that that 1948 was the celebration of independence for Israel and for all Jews, and this really common narrative that I would say all Jews in America and really I think across the world receive, which is that the land of Israel, which is Palestine, was a a land with no people for a people with no land, that this was an empty place, and that we went there and that we made the desert bloom, and that we found safety for ourselves, that we had lived in an incredibly unsafe world and situation as Jews, which is in fact true that we had, and that establishing Israel gave us our only sense of safety in the world, and that this is something we should celebrate and protect. And as I got older and started to hear more things and receive more information, I started to find out that there was something else going on there. And I started to look closer at what I had been told by my father, who's otherwise quite liberal, which was that it's too complicated to deal with. This is just too complicated to even have, any sort of opinion. It can't be resolved. And it wasn't until 2013 that I went there for the first time. And before then, I had already gotten involved in US groups. I was involved in Jewish Voice for Peace and was our chapter leader, and already running boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns. But the first time that I went there, I was shocked. Like, I had gone with this idea that we as Jews were inherently good people, and we wouldn't do things that were terrible, at least not on purpose. And so I arrived to watching children be tear gassed intentionally and walking through checkpoints, and it was heartbreaking for me, just deeply, deeply heartbreaking. And the following year, I brought my two children. My son was 14 at the time, and my daughter was 12, to see the occupation with their own eyes. And we spent 3 weeks staying with Palestinian families in the West Bank to really experience it. And for me, I wanted them to really know what their obligations are.
Have you discussed your current position with your parents, or how do they see your position now?
Yeah, it's evolved in our family, and I know that we'll continue to have this conversation about what's taking place in Jewish American community and how it's beginning to really move, and conversations are beginning to be had. But we had a long period in my family where it was very, very difficult to talk about, and where it was forbidden at the dinner table at family, at like Passover events, to talk about my work or talk about, in fact, Middle East politics were banned from the family conversation. There was for a long time a family rule that if Ariel was at dinner, no discussion of the Middle East. But that's actually changed in the past few years, and I've come to receive a lot of support from my family. And we're watching these shifts in Jewish American opinion, and I think some of them have to do with the election of Donald Trump, but it's quite an exciting time in that way.
All right, can you just, you're part, or you're director in CODEPINK, can you just tell us very briefly what you do? Because I know you do.
Sure.
So,
CODEPINK we're a women-led organization. We formed in 2003 in opposition to the Iraq War. And at the time, and I'll just give a little history of our organization. So at the time, and this was before I was the national co-director or on staff, it was President Bush at the time, and he had implemented these codes for how much at risk and in danger the US was, and they really equated to whether we were going to bomb another city in the Middle East. And it was, code red for immediate danger, and code orange, and it was never code green for safety. So our two co-founders formed CODEPINK, which was the fierceness of women and compassion. So we are opposed to US foreign policy, and we seek to end US militarism and work on a number of issues pretty much where the US is involved militarily. So we work on ending US weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. We're trying to prevent the US from going to war with Iran, and we work on Palestinian rights, and especially focused on what is US policy towards Israel and Palestine, and how can we change our government.
you're an anti-militarist organization, but you're also a feminist organization, is that right?
Yeah.
So how do those two things link together? And why is it necessary to be a feminist organization?
Well, historically, we have found that women are more likely to oppose militarism and to promote peaceful solutions, to work for diplomacy rather than military intervention. And so we like to follow that, that messaging. And we actually have plenty of male members of our organization as well, but we are women-led.
Yeah, just a very short anecdote. Last week I was talking to another New Yorker, an activist, who said that she quoted a lot of research that women made the movements more inclusive and gave more appeal to nonviolent resistance and so on, and that actually women are more, are better revolutionaries because of the way that they do activism. Is that the way that you feel as well? Should we just let the women lead?
Well, I think that it has to depend on which women as well. So, you know, we certainly have plenty of women who are war hawks as well, and we have spent a lot of time as CODEPINK opposing then Secretary Hillary Clinton's policies, which were incredibly militaristic. So we are also equal opportunity protesters in that way.
All right. And can you talk a little bit about the work that you do with Palestine in CODEPINK? And why is that important to you?
Sure. Well, I should begin by saying that the U.S. gives, it's now $3.8 billion a year to Israel in military aid, and it's more money than the U.S. gives to any other country around the world. While we do support other repressive regimes, the U.S. does, such as Egypt, it's by far Israel that gets the most money and the most diplomatic cover for us. So as Americans, right, we have a responsibility for what our government is doing. And I would say that it's, you know, incredibly unlikely that we will be able to see real change in Palestine and Israel without an end of US support for Israel's policies. And so that is a slow and daily work that takes place in the US to try to hold our government officials accountable to what our people really want.
And you talked earlier today, we had a small chat about a piece of legislation that you've, what did you do? Can you tell us how do you work? Like, I want to know how can I get a piece of legislation into the Danish parliament, for example. Can you teach me that?
So, you know, I'll begin by saying that this is, it comes really from all angles, right? It's grassroots, marching in the streets, and writing opinion pieces for the media, and it's giving talks like this and providing education. And it's meeting with our representatives in Parliament or Congress and continuing to like plug away and do this work endlessly. So, you know, in the past year, we've had what for us in the US has been really a major breakthrough, the very first piece of pro-Palestinian rights legislation ever in the US to be introduced. And I should say that this is kind of a low bar that, you know, we've gotten this far before we were able to get even one piece of legislation introduced. And it's our representative Betty McCollum from the state of Minnesota, and it's to end to end U.S. support for Israeli military detention of Palestinian children. Now, that said, this legislation has no chance of passing, and we knew that going in. Those of us that worked with that member of Congress on getting this legislation going. And even if the legislation did pass, it actually has no teeth behind it. It doesn't create any actual change on the ground. And yet it is a stepping stone to get to the next place. And so we continue to work at this and chip away at it as a gradual change. And I think a lot of legislative change comes very gradually, whereas some other things come much faster. But it's part of so many pieces of organizing. It's part of years of marching in the streets and continuing to march in the streets, of meeting with members of Congress and of phone calls and emails, and an enormous amount of grassroots organizing.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about what you do in the US, but you also, as you said, go to Israel sometimes. And there was an incident on the 1st of July. I don't know if that's an appropriate description, but can you tell us what happened when you were there?
Until the 1st of July of this year, I used to travel to Israel and Palestine once or twice a year, and I did so to work on the ground with Palestinians. And I've worked with the Tamimi family in Hebron and the group Youth Against, the Tamimi family in Nabi Saleh, and Youth Against Settlements in Hebron, and many, many others, and kind of live among the people and really, find out what's going on and see what I can both bring home to the US and how I can further my work that way, and see how I can help on the ground. And some of that helping on the ground involves often I have an enormous amount of privilege. I am both white and American, which means that I can travel and pass through many places. It means that I'm not viewed as a danger or a risk. And I'm also, of course, Jewish, so I can get away with many things. So within this time, I have a number of arrests in the West Bank, and still managed to enter the country a number of times over and over, despite this. And the last time that I was there, I had spent the summer of 2017 staying in Hebron. And shortly after arriving there, the right-wing movement there, which is quite large and powerful, kind of got wind that I was there, and I am a fairly well-known activist, including some protests there that are organized by me, a banner drop at the Western Wall, and a variety of things, and they began their own campaign to say that I had to be removed from the country. They were initially calling for me to be deported actively, but that didn't go through, again, probably due to the enormous amount of privilege that I have. Also, while I was there, I was attacked by a settler who slapped me in the face and a number of things, and I filmed the incident live and afterwards took her to court and received a restraining order, and the military had been there while this had happened. And you watch in this video of it, which got shown, to the judge, then in court and in Israeli media, of this long period where she's attacking me, and I'm saying to the soldiers, "You have to help, you have to help." And it was maybe 15, 20 minutes in before they realized that I'm Jewish. And all of a sudden there's this, kind of grumbling around, and what do we do? And that was the only time that things kind of shifted. So when I took the settler to court, the soldiers themselves ended up getting punished. They were forbidden from having coffee at the settler's coffee shop after that. But the punishment, it was really, and they spoke to me about it. They're children, really, and I used to have a lot of conversations with the soldiers about if they think about what they're doing and what they feel about it and where they come from and so on. And what they had told me, at this time is that it was punished because they didn't protect another Jew. There's just this incredibly, incredibly racist system where one group is more deserving than others. So anyway, when I left, I was told that in order to come back, I needed permission from the government in advance. And so I applied for a student visa and enrolled for a university, like a summer 1-month-long university course, and arrived at the airport in Ben Gurion on July 1st, and they were unhappy, to say the least. after about 7 hours, and they had to go through a number of processes to kind of get to high levels to revoke the visa, I was deported. And this began a conversation around what it means even for Israel's own idea of democracy. So Israel markets themselves as the only democracy in the Middle East and this safe and welcoming home, at least for all Jews. And I presented this case where it was very, very clear that this was a welcoming for Jews who agree with the right-wing policies of Israel. And my case was framed very much around myself as a boycott, divestment, and sanctions activist. And absolutely, I am. CODEPINK, we ran our first BDS campaign in 2007, and it was to get Hava skincare products out of the settlements, which we eventually succeeded in doing. And we have run many other BDS campaigns since then, and currently have a couple of them going. But it's my opinion very strongly that when I was denied entry, it had nothing to do with boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Because quite frankly, I have never run a BDS campaign out of Palestine or Israel. That's not where they come from, right? I run BDS campaigns out of the US. I'm trying to get the US to divest. I'm trying to get US consumers not to buy settlement products. US members of Congress not to receive money from Israeli weapons companies and so on, but not from there. And what I really think that this is about, and I'm one of, this was kind of the beginning of a more tightening up at Israel's border, is about preventing relationships with Palestinians working on the ground, about isolating the Palestinian grassroots movement of people struggling on a daily basis to oppose the apartheid policies that they live under, from having solidarity with activists and groups from the outside that were there to support.
Yeah, I told you this story also before we started this event, but I just want to tell it again because I think it showcases quite clearly what you're talking about here. So last week we had this movie screening at the Cinemateka. It was called Naila and the Uprising, about the first Intifada. And Naila, who's kind of the star of the movie, she was a Palestinian activist during the first Intifada, and she was one of the leading characters at that time because many of the men at the time also were imprisoned. So that's another side of the story, that the women were actually leading political figures in Palestine during the first Intifada. But anyways, the Naila and a lot of the other Palestinian women were teaming up with Israeli women at the time and demonstrating and during rallies and so on. And I asked Naila, she was at the screening, I asked her, do you still engage with Israeli women? Because the rallies during the first Intifada were based around women's rights. So we as women see our rights as something universal, not only bound to Israelis or Palestinians or any form of group whatsoever. So she basically, what she had said was, no, I actually don't engage with any of those women anymore, even though it was one of the biggest and most potent women's movements in the 80s, and I think ever since. So I think it's a very deliberate policy that the Israelis have as well. And I want to ask you, this form of divide and conquer, you might say, how do we tackle that? What do we do?
Yeah, I think it's such a fascinating question, and Israel is really, works so hard on this, right? From separating Palestinians in the West Bank from Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in 1948 who are not legally allowed to be in the West Bank, and Jewish Israeli activists who aren't allowed to be in the West Bank, and now this continuous blocking of entry to activists around the world, solidarity activists. And I think part of denying me entry as well is part of this new new plan by Israel as well to attempt to really divide American and diaspora Jewish community, to create separate categories of good Jew and bad Jew, and what lines you have to stay within in order to enter the country, and including for people who have family inside of Israel, diaspora Jews. So I would say that overall it has backfired, because what we're seeing, at least in the U.S., is that by and large, American Jews are relatively progressive and liberal. So I think I might have my numbers off, but I think it's around 70% of American Jews identify as Democrats rather than Republicans, which is our more liberal of the two parties. Each year we see growing trends that more and more American Jews oppose settlements. The majority of American Jews oppose the moving of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I think Israel was hoping that when they started this real denial of entry, and they put it was 6 US groups altogether on this BDS blacklist, including Jewish Voice for Peace, as well as CODEPINK. We're not a Jewish organization, but a number of our leaders and members are, including myself, are Jewish. Was that they thought that other American Jews would kind of shun us, but it's been quite the opposite. In general, the Jewish American community has spoken up and said that they think this shouldn't have happened, and that they think Israel is going too far. And I think what's actually happening is that they are pushing diaspora Jews away from their blind support of Israel and towards a more critical analysis. And I would say that we as a community have a long, long ways to go, but that at least we're moving in the right direction.
So you would say that Jews in the US are moving away from Israel rather than... Yes. And we see that in studies of American Jews and opinion polls, that more and more, and especially younger American Jews, say that they either don't have an attachment to Israel or are critical of Israel. So we're seeing this growing disconnection between American Jews and Israelis.
Yeah. And what effect do you think that will have in the long term? Because as we've also discussed earlier, there is a long historical role that the US has played in sustaining Israeli oppression, basically, and largely, generally across the Middle East, but also in the rest of the world, meddling, interfering, and so on. What do you think specifically for the course that Israel is on now, that the US Jews, subtracting from that, what effect would that have?
Well, so far, Israel seems not to care at all. They seem to, I shouldn't say not to care at all, they seem to be further isolating themselves and kind of alienating themselves. So what we, just recently saw after what is the largest attack against American Jews in American history, the shooting in the Pittsburgh synagogue. So following that, the Israeli Minister for Diaspora Affairs, who is a far-right, pro-settlement, just far-right, part of the far-right Israeli government, decided that he would be the main representative of the Israeli government to come to the U.S. And yes, Naftali Bennett, who has said horrendous things. He has bragged about killing Arabs. He's incredibly anti-immigration, and he came to the U.S. and immediately tried to bring Israeli politics into the conversation. And his statement was something along the lines of, from Sderot to Pittsburgh, or solidarity from Sderot to Pittsburgh, the same hand that shoots missiles also shoots up the synagogue in Pittsburgh. And American Jews were quite outraged, and really said through actions to him, we don't accept that. Like, America is our own community, And what happened in the Pittsburgh synagogue has nothing to do with your racist policies in Palestine. And in fact, this is about homegrown American racism. It's about the white nationalist movement in the US, and that we blame Donald Trump, like absolutely as a community, including American Jews who are still very, very supportive of Israel, really dislike Trump and blame him for the Pittsburgh synagogue. His statements that have been inflaming hate since he's come into power, including in the days before the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, have really brought this into being. So in the days before the shooting in the Pittsburgh synagogue, we had, Donald Trump had put out a tweet about the caravan of migrants and asylum seekers coming through Latin America trying to seek refuge in the US. And he called them invaders, which he's still continuing to do, and also said, and there are some unidentified Middle Easterners among them. And really what he's saying within that is he's trying to invoke this idea of Muslims as terrorists. Well, the shooter in his posts right before firing into the synagogue said, you know, Jews are helping Muslim refugees get into the country, or Muslim terrorists get into the country, and I can't allow this to happen. And then his very infamous, I'm going in, screw their optics, I'm going in. And so American Jews, absolutely, we get this connection, and blame Donald Trump for that. And so Naftali Bennett has come to the US and is continuing to say the attacks on Donald Trump aren't fair, and you know, we support him. And Naftali Bennett is a huge, huge supporter of the Trump administration. When Trump came into power, he basically said, you know, we have 4 years, let's use them well. And we've seen that, right? We've seen that happening within Israel. We've seen settlement growth just expand exponentially. I think in the second quarter of 2018, settlements have grown threefold.
So this alliance between Trump and what is your analysis on, or what does that tell you about the state of Israel as it is right now, where it's going?
Well, we're seeing American Jews move towards more and more liberal policies, you know, pretty much across the board, pro-immigration, pro-reproductive rights, and a variety of issues. Israel, over the past decade, I guess, has been moving rapidly to the right. So, you know, the Netanyahu administration has been partnering with many racists and, frankly, anti-Semites, from Viktor Orban to now congratulating, you know, Brazil on their election. And this partnership with Donald Trump has really been, I would say, probably their favorite. You know, what an exciting partnership of walls and banning refugees.
That's not funny.
Yes.
Okay, this is quite depressing, all of it. Can we just talk a little bit about what can we do? Well, for example, BDS. Let's start with BDS. How do you see that as a viable way to actually isolate Israel even further and try to engage with some kind of solidarity movement that is inclusive as well?
Well, BDS provides something for activists to engage in, a way for us to really campaign and to have an impact. And I think we're really, really seeing it in the cultural boycott, right? As we're continuing to watch artists cancel their performances. And we know that many artists aren't willing to schedule concerts to begin with inside of Israel. So we're watching Israel become more and more isolated in that regard. And we've seen a lot of success in the BDS campaigns that have been running over the years. And so I would say, you know, it really is whatever we can do wherever we are, and that there's a lot of creative ways to be engaged, and we can all look at our communities and see whether it's an educational event, whether it's a protest, whether it's going to Palestine if we are able to get into the country, whether it's working on a BDS campaign or whatever it is that we can do to support the Palestinian struggle and to support Palestinians to lead their own liberation, right? So, I know that when I've spent time, on the ground in the West Bank, I can't go into like a protest in Nabi Saleh and say, you know what, like, I see a way for you to do it better, or this is what I want to do today. But it's for me to arrive there and say, how can I help?
And as we talked about earlier, there's also a feminist element to CODEPINK. Is there a way, I think this is a kind of obvious question to answer, but is there a way for Zionism and feminism to not to merge, but to actually, or to use feminism as a way to counter Zionism? Because what I've experienced is a lot of Jews, my background is mainly Jews in London. I don't know how it is in the US, but a lot of Jews, even on the left, or progressive Jews, even though they're feminist or liberal or whatever it may be, they still have that attachment to Israel. They're still like, oh, but they can't actually let go of that last drop of Zionism. So is there a way that we can actually use those types of ideologies, you might say, to create a more like universal form of activism?
Yeah, well, I would say that feminism is about liberation, and it's about freedom, and that there is no liberation without the liberation of all of us. And I think U.S. activist Linda Sarsour has said this, so well, that Zionism and feminism are incompatible. And I would say that Zionism is incompatible with really any struggle for full equality. It's incompatible with the struggle for racial equality. And we see that regularly in the U.S. between alliances with Black Lives Matter and Palestinian rights, and it's incompatible with the struggle for immigrant rights, especially given the Palestinian refugee population. But it's just, it's something that we have to continue to put out there, and that we have to look at the principles underneath our work and work for liberation for all people. And we've seen that as well in the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. When we had, so we have Naftali Bennett, and we also have Israeli ambassador Ron Dermer, and I think his name is Gabby, saying, they're really putting out this idea of Israel is the only place that Jews will be safe. And look what you saw when in this Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. And Jews in America have really responded with anger to this and said, no way, like, the US is our country, and we make our home here, and we find our safety through solidarity with our brothers and sisters in other movements. In just the few hours after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, I think close to $100,000 was raised by American Muslims to support the synagogue. And on my way here, I was taken past the synagogue in Copenhagen, and saw the armed guards outside, and it really broke my heart. I have to say, in the moments after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, the first thing Donald Trump said he blamed the victims themselves, and he said, if you had had armed guards at the synagogue, this shooting wouldn't have happened. And the response of American Jews has been, no way. Like, it is our value that our synagogue during prayer is an open space, and that we protect ourselves through building a community and through fighting against hate. And we recognize that this isn't just anti-Semitism. So the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter who came in, he was a very strong white nationalist. And the history of white nationalism in the US is that it was born out of the achievement of civil rights for African Americans. And it came from this idea, this incredibly racist idea, that black and brown people would never have been able to achieve these civil rights without the help of the evil Jews, underneath it. So it's really a linked together racism, and as American Jews, it's our responsibility to recognize that we have much more privilege in terms of an oppressed group. And if we look at hate crimes in the U.S., by and large, the majority of them come against black and brown people. They take place in mosques, they take place in black churches, and this is, as it is widening, we're seeing really one of the hate crimes against Jews as well.
That's what everyone. So we were talking about the diaspora element of being a Jewish diaspora and being a Palestinian diaspora, because when I do activism, I have to always consider what are the repercussions. Can I be banned, like, as you have been banned from going to see my family, for example, in Palestine, because the Israelis are actually, they have the power to decide that whether or not I can see my family. So do you have the same feeling? Do you feel like, oh, I should be careful, I might not actually be able to go back?
So certainly I have much more leeway and I exercised much more leeway. I had many years of protesting and being arrested by the Israeli military and all kinds of things before they finally banned me. Yes, but I remember making my first decision that it was worth being banned, and it was when I did a banner drop at the Western Wall, and it was a large banner that said American Jews support BDS, boycott Israel. And if anyone wants to see it, you can Google Ariel Gold BDS banner Western Wall or something, and it'll probably pop right up. But I made a decision that my values were what was most important to me, and that these were my skills and my contribution. And we all have different skills and different contributions that we bring. And for me, that is as an activist, and that this was a badge of honor that I would wear with pride. And we at CODEPINK are very proud to be one of the organizations on the BDS blacklist. And we take it as a sign that we've been doing good work, and that we will continue to do our work regardless. And along with a Jewish background, I also come from a long history of an anti-war background in the US, and an idea that it is often not without sacrifice that we achieve change. And that for many in the US, this has involved sitting in jail or losing jobs or taking risks, and that we all have to decide where our skills and our values lie that way. But for me, that's been my decision.
So, just before we go into Q&A, what would you say to a young Jewish person who's struggling to deal with the fact that they, on one hand, want to do some activism, want to do some good in this world, on the other hand, still feel a connection to Israel and want to be able to go and take part in what they might consider Jewish heritage?
Yeah, well, I guess I can speak a bit for my son. So after I was banned, or after I was deported, and my son was at his Jewish summer camp at the time, and he gets the news on his phone, and he sent me a text message, "Are you okay, Mom? And I hear you were deported," and so on. He decided to write an article, write an open letter in one of the largest Jewish American magazines. It's called The Forward. And it was an article to Rabbi Rick Jacobs, who's the head of the Union for Reform Judaism, which is the largest Jewish organization, religious Jewish organization in the US, and it's the one to which we belong. And ask the question to Rabbi Rick Jacobs, what do you have to say about my mother being banned from Israel, and what do you think this says for Israel, and will you speak out? And he wrote within that article, he said, I'm still developing my own opinions, and they're not the same as my mother. While I support many of the things that she supports, I'm not a BDS activist. I'm not willing to handle the repercussions from that. Or he said, I don't think the repercussions are worth it, and I think that there are many other ways to go about this. And one of the things that he referred to is one of the newest Jewish organizations that we have in the US, which is called If Not Now. And it's a group of young Jews, it only formed in 2014, of young Jews who oppose the occupation. They don't take a stand on BDS, but they take incredibly amazing, bold actions. So just this past summer, and many of you may have seen this, they sent their members on the Birthright trip, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, Birthright is a free trip that is offered by American Jewish organizations. It's actually funded by an extreme right-wing funder of the Republican Party and huge supporter of Donald Trump by the name of Sheldon Adelson. For American Jews, for diaspora Jews, all Jews outside of Israel, to take a 10-day free trip to Israel, and it's a hugely propaganda trip. They're told many things that are just frankly not true. So If Not Now sent groups one after the other of their members on this trip, and they stood up in the middle of the trip on the tour buses and disrupted the trip and said, we demand that you tell us the truth. We demand that you tell us about the occupation. We're looking at your map here, and it doesn't have the green line on it. And then they would walk off the trip and go take an activist tour of Hebron, go into East Jerusalem, and they got incredible media coverage for this. And the American Jewish community stood up and took notice. So that, for example, is one of the things that my son supports.
They ended up having to pay for the trip themselves.
Well, they fundraised very easily for that and raised much more money for their organization than the trip had costed, and had plenty left over. That's another thing that's completely backfired from Israel. So we also saw when the pop singer Lorde canceled her performance in Israel at the request of two New Zealand activists, one Jewish and one Palestinian. They were sued by someone in Israel for, I can't even remember what kind of harm. It's quite a ridiculous lawsuit. But it was quite a lot of money, and they immediately did a fundraiser that went so many times above and beyond the money that they had been fined, and donated it to Palestinian groups.
Great. All right, let's open up the floor. Do we have any questions?
Hello, thank you very much for being here, Ariel. I got a question. I'm thinking about that in Denmark, I meet an increasing amount of Israelis from the left wing in Israel who've left the country out of frustration with Israeli politics. And I'm sure you recognize this, or maybe, I want to ask if you recognize this tendency in the US, and whether these Israelis tend to engage in BDS movement or other kinds of anti-Zionist activism in the US?
Well, unfortunately, as Israel has moved very rapidly to the right, the left wing in Israeli has been really squeezed, and it's very small in terms of Israelis who really engage in support for Palestinian rights. So we see Israelis leaving, and I would also attribute that to Israel is an incredibly repressive place. I know that it isn't a place that I would want my children to grow up, where you have very little room for free thought and creativity outside of these constraints of just pure nationalism and militarism and racism. And when I've traveled throughout Palestine and talked often to the soldiers, and they're so young, they haven't been anywhere, the first thing they always say to me is, "Oh, New York, oh my God, I want to go to New York, I want to get out of here," because it's tiny and squeezed. And Israel continues to seek out more and more isolation, including from their neighbors. And so what a horrendous atmosphere to grow up in. I hope that more and more Israelis, as they leave, get engaged in more bold activism. I certainly know a few, but I wouldn't say it's a huge trend.
So is there an opposite aliyah going on?
I think there has been for a long time. Israelis very much want to get out and go to other places. And we see this from the Israeli government as well. I think they're quite desperate to increase their own population, because Israel is a country that is just fascinated with racist ideas, that they have to control their population, that they want to control the purity of their people, that intermarriage between Jews and Muslims or Jews and Christians is a horrendous thing. So, it's an incredibly confining situation.
Right, thank you. My question is sort of two-way question, I guess. Also, thank you for being here, Gold. First question, first part of the question is, have you thought of what your next step as an activist is going to be? Is there something in the works, or just doing whatever comes naturally? And second part is, what is a realistic end goal, if you could say? So, with your activism, have anything in mind, or once again, just rolling with it?
Well, especially in the US, but I would say everywhere around the world, we have our work cut out for us. We have a term in the US right now called activism, protest fatigue, right? We have so many incredibly repressive and racist policies being thrown at us daily, whether it's a Supreme Court nominee who wants to remove rights for women, or sending thousands of the US military to meet the caravan of migrants coming up from Latin America, that we are out in the streets on a regular, daily basis. And I hear sometimes people in the US talk about, out of fear for what we're going through with the Trump administration, of wanting to leave to be safe. But on the other hand, it's through standing together and working with each other and showing up for all of our communities that we have any real hope of protection.
I'm surprised we haven't had a question about the two-state solution yet. Maybe there's one down here. Do we have a mic? No? Do you have another question? All right, we'll take the question, it's fine.
Yeah, hi, and I also want to thank you for coming. I have a question about what you talked about before, about the Democratic Congresswoman, Betty McCollum, who seems to be able to suggest legislation that's beyond what other members of Congress have been able to do. And I'm just wondering, what is it that she's doing right? I remember Jimmy Carter used to say that it was impossible for American politicians beyond a very low level, like mayor of a small town or something, to not be loyal to Israel. So what is it that Betty McCollum is doing differently, and is there a sort of path, something opening up for American politicians to wiggle their way out of this AIPAC grip that they all seem to be in?
Well, I would have to say it's not her alone. So there are co-sponsors on the bill, and there's a number of members of Congress that have been shifting away from blind support from Israel in the past couple of years. And this is really just thanks to ongoing grassroots work, because when we go in and talk to members of Congress, when I go in and talk to them and say, you know, this is what I need from you, they say, have my constituents, which means constituents, just making sure I get the language right, it means the locality that you represent. Have my constituents tell me, like have them let me know. So it's really that grassroots change as on the ground. As you change your community, then your community has the ability to change their elected officials. And so we've seen this breakthrough in the past couple of years beginning to really take place. And we in the US are going into an election in the next couple of days. And while we don't know entirely how it's going to turn out, and we do know that we have a few much more radical members of Congress that will be coming in, members of Congress that have spoken out much more for Palestinian rights, and we're seeing some real shifts in that. We're also going to see our first Muslim American woman who wears hijab go into office in Congress. It's an uncontested race. So, you know, it's thanks to this massive amount of work that, you know, we had the Women's March right after the election, and people have really shown up and done the work so that we're laying the groundwork for change. And we have a long ways to go as well. You know, you mentioned AIPAC, and for anybody who isn't familiar, AIPAC is the Israeli lobby in America, and for a very long time they have had a real stranglehold on American politics, and the way that they operate and do things is that if a member of Congress does not vote in the pro-Israel way that's been outlined for them, which includes voting against the Iran nuclear deal, voting for more military aid for Israel, and all the way down the line, voting to outlaw BDS and so much more, then AIPAC will fund somebody to run against them and give them an enormous amount of money. But we've seen in the past couple of years AIPAC begin to lose some of its grip on Congress, and we're seeing some of the results of that now.
So nice to hear. And we have a question over here.
I spoke to you during the break a little bit about what you said just before the break, that armed protection of synagogues was a bad idea. And I wanted to make sure that you really meant that. And my question is, what's the alternative? I have Googled this subject, and it seems that there is already now being investigated in synagogues all around your country, how to maximize protection. And then a rabbi says that we need then, if we should have armed protection and other kinds of protection, we should have economical support from the state. In Copenhagen a few years ago, there was in the synagogue of Denmark, the main synagogue, there was a guard who was shot and killed by a young, you could say terrorist, a young guy. And then after that, first the police and now even military, heavily armed Danish soldiers are protecting this synagogue. I don't know if you knew that, but do you think that's a bad idea? And what's the alternative in your country for more protection of churches, mosques, and synagogues, if not the the armed one?
Well, I should begin by saying that it's a Jewish tradition and value to leave our doors open as we pray. This is a way of welcoming in our community and sharing our faith and creating a loving space for all people. And that's what prayer and religion are about for me, and I think that's pretty universal. I can also speak to, I don't believe that it's through militarization and through weapons that we keep our communities or our world safe. We in the US, we have a huge problem with militarism, including the militarization of our police force, who are by and large trained in Israel, and show up on the streets of the US in like an army, as an army, and continuously shoot black and brown people, tear gas crowds, and so much more, and it never has made a community safer. I also have to say that we in the US have a huge, huge problem with guns. And this is not only in terms of protecting synagogues or other places of worship. This is, we have shootings in US schools on a regular basis. And it's certainly not just synagogues that have shootings. In the same few days in which the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting took place, a white nationalist had attempted to enter, but the doors were in this case closed, a church in Kentucky, a black church, and unable to get in, he instead walked into a supermarket and killed 2 black people. And this is a fairly regular occurrence in the US. We have shootings on a very regular basis, and we've had some really notorious, horrific, huge shootings in schools. And along with an Israel lobby, we have a very, very strong gun lobby. And their response is that the best protection is to give the teachers guns. And this is a real discussion that's taking place in the US about whether our teachers should be armed to protect their students. And our students in America have regular drills. I imagine children here have drills in case of a fire or other type of emergency. Well, in the US, we also have drills for active shooters, where in a certain amount of time, the children all get under the desks and away from the windows, and the doors are all locked, and they do scouting for an active shooter in the hallway, because this happens in the US. And it is never through more guns that we're going to find ourselves being more safe. It is through more gun control and through demilitarization, through no longer funding the weapons companies and the gun companies, and instead investing in schools and hospitals and healthcare and infrastructure. And in the US, these are things that we are all incredibly lacking in. And so I think that's the solution in our places of worship as well. It's through work to dismantle racism in all of its forms and create a more safe and loving space for all people.
And it reminds me of this Netflix. What's his name?
You didn't answer the question. I asked, what's the alternative? You gave a long lecture. Thank you for that. But if you want more protection in synagogues, as in churches and mosques, what's your alternative? Your idea? You said what you didn't like. What do you like?
We protect each other by dismantling racism and hate, and by teaching the values that we all have as human beings, the universal values of caring for each other, and we work to build a safer world. And we never work to build that world through militarization and through the funding of our weapons companies.
We have one more question down here.
Okay, this question is a little more personal, I hope it's okay, because I had the honor to talk to you before, and you told me that there's actually, from what I understood, there's 2 shifts you did in your life, and I'm not sure what they're, like, you were raised in a secular family and you chose to join a religious community, and you belong to a synagogue now and you raise your kids like that. And the other shift is that, as you said, you had a great Zionist in your family and you became an anti-Zionist. So I was wondering, what came first, or how is there a connection? Or
Sure. So I think I'll sort of speak to each one separately. In terms of so I was raised without really any connection to Judaism and without knowing the Jewish prayers or much about the Jewish holidays. And I felt that there was something missing from my life, both culturally and for my children, kind of a community and a belief system. And that's something that I wanted to find for myself. And so we belong to, I'm a member of the Union for Reform Judaism, as I said, which is for anybody who doesn't know what Reform is, it's a fairly liberal strain of Judaism, but I did bring my children through bar and bat mitzvah, and we are part of that community. And at times it's very, very difficult. It is a heavily Zionist community in the U.S., and there have been times at my own synagogue where I've been told in many ways that I'm not welcome. My children have gone through some bullying and times of being told that their mother is a terrorist or supports terrorism. And for me, these are my Jewish values, to speak for freedom and justice and equality. And in many ways, they are Jewish tradition. And so...
Can I ask how do you deal with that, being almost shunned from your own community or your own synagogue?
Yeah, it's definitely painful at times. There's times that it's been very painful, but I would have to say that I have to look into my heart and know what is right for myself, and to follow those values, and to build a community internationally as well as locally of people that do support me. So I do have a rabbi that supports me very closely, and to provide that strength for my children as well, for them to find their own voice and know their own truth. And then the second one would be about Zionism. So I mentioned that I had grown up in a very social justice-oriented family, and a very anti-war family. So I grew up protesting against nuclear weapons and against US imperialism and racism. And so as I started to learn what was happening, and a lot of this, for me at least, and this is what young Jews in America, many of them are fighting for, we didn't have the information even. And so as I started to find this information and look at, oh, this is what Zionism is? Well, it's totally contrary to my values otherwise, to my values against militarization, against colonization. And so it was just a very logical conclusion for me, even if at times painful.
Great. We have time for a few more questions. One here.
I would just like if you could tell a little more about the left-wingers in Israel.
So they're very few, in my experience, and certainly I'm not there, not able to go in anymore and work with them. But you know, Israel as an incredibly repressive country, and you know, we're dealing with more repression here in the U.S., but in a place where it's already taken place, right? It's illegal in Israel to support BDS, for example, and they're right now in Knesset debating a bill that would have jail time for supporting BDS. You know, for example, if an Israeli chooses not to join the military and it chooses to go to jail instead, not only do they have to deal with that period of imprisonment, but afterwards it's nearly impossible to find a job. Because for your job applications there, your commander is one of the references that you're expected to give. So it's an incredibly isolating and difficult experience for Israeli Jews. And we're, you know, there's all kinds of laws going in more often. So we see left-wing Israeli groups like Breaking the Silence, who are ex-soldiers who speak out about their time in the military and what it was actually like. We've seen that organization be banned from entering schools because they used to give a lot of talks in schools. So it's a society that is being more and more squeezed, and there are, you know, it's a small and dedicated group of left-wing activists, and I think you know that group, but it's a really painful and difficult problem. I know that you know, any of the backlash that I face in the U.S., and I have had some times of some difficult, you know, death threats or various things, nothing compared, I think, to what Israelis who are activists receive. That vile hatred and sense of being unsafe is so much more extreme.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, I think we do. one over there. Maybe while we get the mic up there, I can ask you, do you, as an organization, CODEPINK, have any affiliations or connections with activists working in Palestine or Israel?
We do. We work with a lot of groups, actually. So we've partnered with Youth Against Settlements in the West Bank, and we work with the Tamimi family to lift up the stories of their community inside Israel. We work with a Coalition of Women for Peace, which is an organization, a women-led organization that supports BDS. I have connections with Bet Salem, and yeah, we're a pretty open group about working with, and you know, I have a lot of respect for Israeli activists who are willing to, you know, stay true to their principles in this really difficult circumstance, and we try to support their work as much as possible.
We have a question from the audience.
Yeah, this is also more of a personal question, but I'm not Jewish myself, but I have Jewish family in Denmark and in Israel. And I feel like it's often very hard to have this conversation with them, especially because I don't feel the same way about Israel as they do. They're very pro-Israel. And I often at times feel very misled about what they're telling me, because when I do my own research, I don't feel like what they're saying is the complete truth, but they're also, because some of them is converted, so they're very like extreme compared to the family I've had that is not converted. So it was just more of how you do it when you have these conversations.
Well, I should begin by saying that some friends or family I find there's no use in having the conversation, that it's a futile conversation to have. And you know, one of the first questions is this a productive question? Is this somebody that's opening to hearing, and can we preserve our relationship regardless? And if it is a conversation within that, you know, framework where you feel like you can have a dialogue, and there, you know, I would recommend going to both Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now, put out talking points, and especially around the Jewish holidays, of like, here's how to talk about the occupation over Passover dinner, and using language that sometimes these people are able to hear, sometimes our relatives. For me, it's often helped to tell personal stories, rather than talking about specific policies, to talk about my own experiences and people that I know, Palestinians on the ground, what it was like for the Tamimi family to have their 17-year-old daughter be arrested, and how that feels to any parent, and to kind of humanize those stories.
We have one more question up here. And the mic is being passed around.
Yeah, that was just a question about, in your experience, whether you find more secular or religious Jews in the activism you do, BDS activism or other kinds of activism against the Israeli lobby. Is it mainly secular or religious?
You know, I think it really spans across, and we're seeing, so If Not Now are largely Jews that grew up much more religious than I am today, and they've come to use those values and those prayers and those songs that they grew up with to embrace freedom and justice for all people and liberation for Palestinians and Israelis alike. On the other hand, secular Jews are, you know, populated throughout the activist movement for Palestinian rights, and I think there's probably fewer Orthodox, though we do have the group Naturi Karta, who are an anti-Zionist Orthodox group.
So it's 50-50?
Between I'm not sure the percentage, but between, say, like secular and reform and conservative, which are the liberal strains, it might be 50-50.
Do we have any more hands? Yeah, we have one more question here.
Well, since you were talking about the consequences of your activism within the Jewish society in the US, I couldn't help to wonder if being an activist, a Jewish activist, pro-Israel, if that had any negative consequences for your everyday life outside the Jewish society in America.
Well, I would have to say I'm an activist on a lot of issues. So on a regular basis, you can find me outside or outside the Saudi or the U.S. Embassy, the Saudi Arabia Embassy in the U.S., protesting so many things, protesting Yemen. You can find me advocating for peace in Iran. And so we have a strong community, and I think that we have to look across issues, right? That the roots of Zionism are really in settler colonialism and in racism. When the state of Israel was founded and Palestinians were expelled, it was built on this idea that Palestinians are less than human and that Jews are superior. So this is a question of equality that's actually much broader than being pro-Israel or anti-Israel. And so I'm glad to have, and there is across the world, such a large number of people that are working for human rights.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? If not, I do have a few left. Can you just tell us a little bit about the work that you've done in the Palestinian territories and what your experiences have been before being banned?
Sure. So, gosh, I'm trying to sort of think of where to start with that. So I spoke about doing the action at the Western Wall. I've spent a lot of time in villages like Nabi Saleh, attending their weekly protests and standing beside them inside of Hebron, which is the most heavily occupied city in the West Bank with I think it's 22 checkpoints and over 100 movement barriers. I've spent time helping give the tours where Palestinians can't go, on the various streets where Palestinians can't go, and providing myself as somebody willing to stand alongside and lend my support. I spent a lot of time meeting families and getting to know them and having the conversations that I think we all need to have, as well as other protests. Would it be about a year and a half ago in the winter, I was there with a US group called Veterans for Peace, which are former US military who now work against all militarism, and they travel to a lot of places, whether it's South Korea or Japan, to work against US military bases. And last year, that year they did a delegation to Palestine, and this is an incredibly bold and brave group of people. So we marched alongside with Palestinians as we were tear gassed and shot at, and stood in front of settlers to try to help prevent attacks, and kind of a variety of. What?
Everyday life.
Everyday life in Palestine, absolutely.
I have one more question
here. Yeah, I'm sorry, I have another question. I'm not sure if this is a personal or principal question, but it's something that's been weighing on me a lot. One of the things you often hear in debates about Palestine is that Palestinians are using their children in activism. And of course, we know that the civil rights movement also used children on the ground, and children were part of the civil rights movement. And now I hear from you that in some way or other your children are also part of your activism. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, what do you do when you dedicate your life to justice or in some necessary struggle? What kind of choices do you make as a parent? Do you have any principled thoughts about this? Because this is a kind of a great mystery to me as a father myself, how to navigate that, because I'm an activist myself as well.
Well, I think we all bring our values to our children, and I know that I leave this world to my children, and it's a pretty scary world that it is, so I hope to teach them the skills to be part of the community of human rights defenders. And in Palestine, I often hear my friends who are asked this question, respond by saying, my children are at risk every day. By teaching them how to resist and how to hold their own dignity, and giving them the skills to go forward. And if we're not passing this on, so we have a saying in Judaism, and you shall teach this to your children. And I think if there's the most important thing that I have to pass on to my children are my values for human rights and what it means to be an activist. And this has been, it's a long struggle that we're in, because when we look at the issues and we look at the rise of fascism in this world, absolutely, I would say our children need the skills of resistance going forward.
There's a follow-up question?
No, thanks.
All right. We have one next to you.
Okay, so I have another question about the diaspora Jews. There's a personal element to it, because I'm curious if you yourself have a family in Israel. Because I was wondering about, I'm Israeli and I have a family. My father is Canadian and have a large family there. And I remember this relationship that I grew up with, that we as the Israeli part of the family, we were so proud and we felt so superior, and there was this admiration from them, And we felt also that they owe us something, because we believe that we keep this shelter for them, because the Holocaust can always come back, and then they'll all run to us and take protection. And the fact that my brother is in the army, so he secures this for them, and they should be grateful. Like, that was the discourse underneath everything, and I think it's still really strong. Like when we meet them, and it's like a taboo. Like, they're not allowed to criticize Israel because they're in this inferiority position of that one day they'll need our protection or something like that. And it's not really rational, as we all know, because Israel is the least safe place for Jews in the world. But it's so refreshing for me to see that you dare to do it, and I wonder, how do you dare to do it? Do you not have Israeli family, or how do you do it?
So I do have an Israeli family, and at times I've been unwelcome in their homes when I was still allowed to enter, and there are many times that I've said, "Oh, I'd love to come for lunch. I'm here," and we would prefer not to have you. But I think that, and I think this is growing more and more in diaspora, this rejection of the idea that that diaspora Jews don't have the right to criticize the policies of Israel. And certainly as American Jews, we have the right to criticize our own institutions that are propping up Israeli policies. And I think at all times that, as Jews, and you hear it from Jewish leaders, right? We hear it from Naftali Bennett and from Netanyahu, we are all one family. Well, if we're all one family, then we're in this together. And if we see something horrific happening in our names, then we have an obligation, I would say, to speak out, even when it's difficult. And just as you said, Israel is the least safe place for Jews in the world, and the most effective way to prevent another Holocaust is through building a safer world for all of us. And by and large, when we look around the world, we do have to recognize that Jews are not at all the most vulnerable group facing oppression. It's our black and brown brothers and sisters who are on the very front lines and are dealing with the most severe effects. And so we have to stand together for each other and build the community that we all deserve.
Do you feel that all Jews are obliged to actually take a stand towards Israel?
Personally, I think so, absolutely.
How so?
Well, I would say that as long as the state of Israel claims to speak in the name of all Jews, that all Jews have a responsibility to respond to that. And at the very least say, take a side, like which side are you on? Either you speak for me or you don't speak for me. You represent me or you don't represent me.
We have a question over here.
Yes, for me. I was curious to hear your thoughts on zooming out of Israel specifically, but I want to hear your thoughts on U.S. Middle East policy before and after Trump, because everyone has been really active with criticizing Trump with being pro-Israel and blah blah blah, which he is. But Obama, I don't know if he still is, but he was definitely the most Israel-friendly president of the U.S. And people seem to kind of forget that, and also that Hillary Clinton is an extremely war hawk, and we tend to kind of neglect that because they're Democrats, so maybe they're liberal or whatever. So what's your thoughts on that? Like, how has it changed? Because it has changed, but how exactly? And especially regarding Iran, because I know CODEPINK also focuses on Iran, and I guess this is not a secret, your Facebook is public, but I saw that you were fundraising for a group trip to Iran. You want to visit and see what it is, how it is there, and do advocacy work back in the US. So your thoughts on US Middle East politics before and after.
Sure. Well, I think I have to go back to U.S. militarism and U.S. support for the military-industrial complex, for weapons companies, and for U.S. intervention across the world is really, really bipartisan. So, this is something that has been supported by Democrats and Republicans alike, including support for Israel. And it was at the end of President Obama's term that U.S. military aid to Israel was increased to $3.8 billion a year. It's been implemented under Trump, but it began under Obama. And what we've seen under Trump is it really go into overdrive and become much more reckless. I think moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, among other things, was reckless. It really, pushed things, and Trump has said to Palestinians, he's given up the facade of support for any type of solution, and in some ways that's fairly refreshing, right? Because we certainly were getting nowhere under any other administration either. In terms of Iran, I would say that the Iran nuclear deal was probably the greatest diplomatic achievement of President Obama, and it was something that has been supported around the world. And what we're seeing with Trump tearing up the deal, and for him, I would say this is a way of making his base very happy. This was a campaign promise that he said, and now he's showing that he can follow through. But the people who will actually suffer are Iranians on the ground, who are already feeling the effects of these sanctions. And this is again the alliance with Netanyahu, who has been looking for war with Iran for a long time and now has found much of a partner with Trump. And we in CODEPINK and across the US are quite concerned about the next US war and that it could likely take place in Iran. So we're trying to work early on this situation and do what we can. I think we're going to see what happens after Trump leaves office, and hopefully that's in the next 2 years and not much longer, because the effects of these policies are going to be quite long-standing. But Israel has definitely had the opportunity to go into overdrive, And we've seen it with settlements, and we're watching it with the cutting of U.S. aid and the end of pretty much U.S. recognition for any recognition for international law. And it's an incredibly dangerous situation.
So just picking up on that, where do you see a viable solution to this whole ordeal? Are you, this is probably not the answer, are you still a fan of the two-state solution?
I don't think I was ever a fan of the two-state solution. By the time that I really got involved in the movement, I would say the two-state solution was already far past
what's the alternative?
Possible.
As the politics are now, what's the alternative to that solution?
Well, on the one hand, I would say we are very far away from a specific political solution, and that we need to work towards basic human rights and the restoration of policies that support that. On the other hand, we are looking at the possibility any day of this new proposed peace plan by the Trump administration. It will likely be a plan that's, well, it was at least on the path of being heavily supported by Saudi Arabia, which can never be a good sign. And so I think we're going to have our work cut out for us to deal with whatever it is that comes at us in that way. What I hear from Palestinians on the ground, and I think this really needs to be led by Palestinians, is that this is becoming a civil rights struggle, and will likely be a struggle for a one-state full equality for all people.
I think that is probably the best way to go forward as well. Do we have any closing comments or questions for Ariel? Just want to make sure that everyone feels heard. No? All right. In that case, I want to say thank you very much for joining us and for coming today. And please give Ariel a round of applause.
Thank you so much for all that you do. And
Are you going to stick around for a while? Or?
I think so.
So I'll be here and Ariel will be here. You can always come down and have a chat.
Yeah, please.
Thank you for coming.